Dr. Marcos was never one to be swayed by illusions. For him, every symptom had an explanation, every ailment a cause and a concrete solution. Deep down he liked the predictable, an endless cycle of shifts, diagnoses and prescriptions he knew by heart. On that cold night, the hospital seemed to breathe alongside him. The silence was thick, interrupted only by the occasional monotonous beeps of machines, as if the building itself was asleep, echoing the indifference he felt toward most of the cases that passed through his hands. The dim corridor lights cast soft shadows on the walls. He walked, recognizing each curve, each door, the spot where the floor creaked a bit louder, the familiar smell of antiseptic in the air. This was his second home, a place he knew completely. His work, after all, was technical, predictable, and to him, purely a matter of science. For a moment, he paused by the corridor window, looking at his reflection alongside the distant city lights flickering outside. The street lights seemed cold, as distant as the way he regarded each patient. Just another body, another medical puzzle to solve. Yet that night, as silence hung around him, Dr. Marcos didn't know that beyond his routine and predictability, something awaited him, something that would challenge every certainty he had carefully cultivated. A soft intercom buzz interrupted the silence, summoning Dr. Marcos to a newly admitted patient's room. With a hint of impatience, he walked down the hallway. The patient was Mr. Antonio, an elderly blind man awaiting his exam. Upon opening the door, the doctor was met with a fragile-looking figure who nonetheless exuded a curious calm. Even with his eyes clouded by blindness, Antonio's face held a subtle trace of peace, almost as if he saw something beyond the impersonal clinical environment around him. As he reviewed the file, Dr. Marcos noted the patient's advanced age and the diagnosis of blindness with no apparent cause, something he had experienced since youth. Despite his frail appearance, there was something almost mysterious in how Mr. Antonio sat, hands folded one over the other, like someone patiently waiting for an outcome he already knew. It was an odd, unsettling contrast. But for Dr. Marcos, who didn't allow emotional distractions, Mr. Antonio was just another case to be treated. He approached and began the examination, noting that while he performed each procedure, the elderly man maintained a faint smile, almost as if he knew something the doctor didn't. A chill ran down Marcos's spine, but he quickly shook off the discomfort. He was there to solve a problem, not to get lost in assumptions. With the flashlight in hand, Dr. Marcos started the eye examination, a procedure he had performed countless times. He adjusted the light, moving it from side to side to get a better view. But when he focused directly on Mr. Antonio's pupils, something made him freeze. There was a strange glow, a kind of deep, pulsing light that seemed to come from within the elderly man's own eyes. He blinked, adjusted the flashlight, thinking it might be an external reflection, a trick of the lighting. But looking again, the phenomenon persisted, a faint yet visible light that shouldn't be there. This isn't possible, he muttered, adjusting the angle, searching for a logical explanation. Dr. Marcos, a man of science and reason, felt the weight of something unusual pressing on the moment. His mind reached for a medical answer, something that could fit a diagnosis, but none of his years of study or practice offered any explanation. "Doctor, did you see something unusual?" asked Mr. Antonio in a calm tone, with a slight smile that suggested he was, somehow, aware of what was happening. Marcos hesitated, feeling a chill down his spine but remained silent. Not knowing what to think, he stepped back and stayed quiet. How could there be light in a blind man's eyes? Dr. Marcos withdrew from Mr. Antonio, his mind racing. He had seen many strange cases, but nothing that resembled what he had just witnessed. The unexplainable glow in the elderly man's eyes lingered like a persistent shadow in his mind. He took a deep breath, trying to reason it out. Could it be a rare anomaly, maybe an unusual reflection from some ocular tissue? But a light like that? He knew he couldn't explain it with science alone, and as he tried, every justification felt hollow. A growing unease set in. Something in that gaze seemed to want to tell him more, and although it went against every rational instinct, he felt there was something beyond the natural at play. He was alone, on call, and the weight of the responsibility pressed down on him. After a few seconds of hesitation, he picked up the phone and dialed, his voice low and controlled. "Yes, I need a team here. Something happened with a patient and I think this should be investigated." As soon as he hung up, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over Marcos. Part of him knew he was crossing a line by involving the authorities, but another part, driven by curiosity, felt he'd done the right thing. The sound of sirens sliced through the hospital's silence, drawing curious glances and whispers down the hallways. Shortly after, two officers appeared at the entrance, their expressions serious and steps firm, causing a subtle stir among the staff. Though everyone tried to hide it, the officers' presence sparked a rising unease. Dr. Marcos, waiting for them in the lobby, felt a weight in his chest as they approached. He was a man used to emergencies, but none had involved the police before. Trying to control his nerves, he signaled for them to follow him to a more private area, away from the eyes of patients and nurses. Once they reached a small empty break room, the officers turned toward him, and Dr. Marcos, swallowing hard, began to explain. "I know it sounds strange, but while examining a patient I noticed something that I can't explain logically." He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. It was as if there was a light in his eyes. Something I've never seen before. The officers exchanged glances, perhaps skeptical, but attentive. The doctor's unusual description stirred a mix of curiosity and disbelief in both of them, while Dr. Marcos, with tense eyes, tried to remain calm. One of the officers, with a doubtful look, finally broke the silence. "Can we see the patient?" With a nod, Dr. Marcos led them toward Mr. Antonio's room, the growing tension casting an invisible, somber shadow over the hospital with every step. As they entered Mr. Antonio's room, the officers observed the elderly man lying peacefully, seemingly indifferent to the commotion around him. He appeared fragile, harmless, but Dr. Marcos's words echoed in the officers' minds, casting a strange atmosphere. One officer, holding a small flashlight, approached, leaning in to examine Antonio's eyes. He directed the beam of light directly into the elderly man's pupils, expecting nothing more than the usual ocular reflex. But as he focused, something unusual caught his attention. A faint glow, almost like a tiny flame, flickered in the depths of Antonio's blind eyes. He pulled back, an incredulous look crossing his face, and turned to his partner beside him. Do you see that?" the officer whispered, his voice tense. The second officer leaned in, hesitant, and looked into Mr. Antonio's eyes as well. After a moment of thick silence, he nodded slightly, confirming. A chill ran down everyone's spine in the room, including Dr. Marcos, who watched with a mixture of perplexity and discomfort. Mr. Antonio, meanwhile, remained quiet as if none of this were happening, his expression a blend of tranquility and mystery. The tension was palpable. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. What exactly were they witnessing in that hospital room? When the officers finished examining Mr. Antonio's eyes, they decided to investigate his background. One of them pulled out a tablet, accessing old files and records. Bit by bit, fragmented information surfaced, leaving everyone in the room stunned. Mr. Antonio was connected to an unsolved case, a series of dark crimes from decades ago that remained shrouded in mystery and horror. He was the last living person directly linked to the case. Standing beside them, Dr. Marcos listened to the officers discussing the revelations with a mix of disbelief and shock. The serene and frail image he had of the elderly man began to crumble. To him, Antonio was simply a vulnerable old man, someone life had treated harshly, leaving him blind and alone. But suddenly he found himself questioning his own limited view of people. What else could be hidden beneath the seemingly simple exteriors of the other patients he cared for? One of the officers looked at Dr. Marcos, noting the shocked expression on his face. "You never suspected, did you?" he said in a grave voice. "Most people wouldn't believe it. He kept that secret his whole life." Mr. Antonio remained motionless, staring into the void, almost as if he was aware of the weight of his dark memories. Dr. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that perhaps for the first time he didn't have all the answers. And with that realization came an unsettling new truth. He was beginning to see people in a new light, recognizing that each one carried unfathomable mysteries and secrets that might never be revealed. Dr. Marcos sat in a chair, still shaken by the revelation about Mr. Antonio. His mind was racing. He had always prided himself on being a rational doctor, following science and protocols with precision. Yet now he found himself entangled in a mystery far beyond scientific understanding. He felt the weight of having called the police. Was it really my role? He wondered, his doubts piling up. Over the years, he had learned to be objective, to avoid being swayed by emotions or hasty judgments. And here he was questioning himself. The feeling that he had crossed a line between medicine and something almost unknown unsettled him deeply. What would have happened if he had ignored the strange reflection in Antonio's eyes? Perhaps he could have let the patient leave in peace without exposing his past. But at the same time, he knew his discovery might have been a truth that needed to come to light. This inner conflict ate at him. He felt caught between his professional duty and a profound sense of humanity, wondering if by following protocol, he had betrayed his own principles. After all, his role as a doctor was to save lives, not to uncover secrets. And there, alone, Dr. Marcos found himself dealing with an unfamiliar discomfort, almost an anguish that even years of experience hadn't prepared him for. Still lost in his thoughts, Dr. Marcos encountered Dr. Julia in the corridor. She was an attentive and observant resident and noticed something was troubling him. With a gentle, genuine look, she asked, "Dr. Marcos, is everything all right?" He hesitated, but something in her young and encouraging presence made him open up. "Julia, I never thought a simple examination would make me question so much. I feel like I crossed a line I'm not sure I should have crossed. Should I have left Antonio in peace? Was it worth following protocol?" Julia listened intently, taking in each word. "Dr. Marcos," she replied calmly, "we were trained to trust science, the facts. But we're also human, and sometimes instinct, that feeling, speaks louder. You acted with awareness and compassion. Maybe that's where the real value of our work lies." Her words were simple but struck deeply. At that moment, he realized that medicine wasn't just a science of diagnoses, but also a practice of humanity. The intuition he had always dismissed might actually be his greatest ally. Returning to Antonio's room, Dr. Marcos observed him in silence. Before, he had seen only an elderly blind man, but now he noticed the deep lines on his face, the calmness that hid pains and stories. Something about that peaceful expression seemed to speak silently, as if every wrinkle told a fragment of a life marked by choices and sacrifices. Marcos slowly approached, feeling a newfound respect and empathy for this man. He was no longer just a doctor assessing symptoms, he was someone who wanted to understand the soul behind the physical condition. Antonio was not just a patient. He was a living story, someone who had likely endured more than any medical report could describe. "Mr. Antonio," he said with a warmer tone, "I know you may not understand why all this is happening, but know that I'm here, not only as a doctor but as someone who cares." Antonio gave a faint smile, and in that moment, a silent yet profound connection arose between them. For the first time, Dr. Marcos saw beyond the limitations of his own biases, realizing that, just like science, the act of caring went beyond logic. Dr. Marcos took a deep breath, allowing himself to be enveloped by the wave of compassion now filling his thoughts. All the skepticism he had carried from years of medical practice seemed to fade, leaving in its place a genuine commitment to the well-being of the man before him. Antonio had revealed truths that would shake anyone, yet Dr. Marcos saw in him not only a past story but the dignity of someone who still had a future, however brief it might be. In that instant he decided his role wasn't to judge but to care. With a steady, serene demeanor, he approached Antonio and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Antonio," he said, his voice resolute, "regardless of what came before, my commitment is with you now. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure you receive the dignified and respectful care you deserve." The calm on Antonio's face suggested a silent gratitude, an acknowledgement that, despite everything, someone chose to see him with humanity. And at that moment, Dr. Marcos knew that beyond protocols, a doctor's true duty was to see the person beyond the patient, offering not just treatment but a look of respect and empathy. As the hours passed and the night settled over the hospital, Dr. Marcos remained silent, immersed in deep reflection. What he had experienced alongside Mr. Antonio had shaken his deepest certainties, gradually dismantling the wall of rationality he had built over the years. For the first time, he faced the possibility that perhaps not everything could be reduced to science or explained by logic. Dr. Marcos realized that, as a doctor, he was sometimes called to navigate a world of mysteries beyond his comprehension. The complexity of human beings, their hidden secrets and pains, had revealed themselves to him in a way books had never taught. With a deep sigh, he decided to let go of some of the rigidity that had accompanied him, accepting that not all answers would come to light, and that it was okay. Now, instead of only seeing symptoms and diagnoses, he committed himself to seeing people. He promised that with every patient, every life that crossed his path, he would bring not only his medical knowledge but also a closer, more compassionate attention. That night, Dr. Marcos understood that the essence of being a doctor wasn't about having all the answers but about embracing mysteries with humility and offering his humanity in every gesture of care. With the hospital's silence in the background and the early morning lights illuminating the nearly empty streets, Dr. Marcos walked slowly toward the parking lot. It had been a long night, but something inside him felt lighter, as if he had finally put down an invisible weight he had carried for so long. He felt the impact of the experience he'd lived through, the quiet transformation that now accompanied him, etched deeply in his soul. As he crossed the gate, the chill of dawn touched his face, but he didn't mind. In that moment, Dr. Marcos was no longer just the skeptical, technical doctor who had entered the hospital hours earlier. He knew he had reached a turning point, something that felt like a calling. He could no longer view people merely as cases or diagnoses. There was a higher purpose in his work, something that transcended the simple act of healing. Now he saw himself as part of something bigger, an interwoven fabric of lives and stories where he was invited to participate, to listen, to care. Every patient, every person who would cross his path, would be seen with new eyes and with the compassion he might never have allowed himself to feel before. With one last look at the hospital, Dr. Marcos took a deep breath, feeling ready for the challenges life would bring. He got into his car, but before starting the engine he paused for a moment, smiling to himself. He knew that after that night he would never be the same. Did you like the story? Comment below what you thought of this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.